It's 7:03 now. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is being held on the lands of the First Peoples of this land we call Australia. It's many peoples and many lands. And I wish to acknowledge these peoples as the traditional owners of this land that has never been ceded. I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present and emerging. We continue to live in hope that we keep on walking with them towards a reconciliation that closes the gap and a future that involves justice, truth-telling and self-determination. I'll just run through the program for tonight. Professor Joe Camilleri will make a presentation for about 20 minutes, and then Naomi Wolf will be invited to respond for about 10 minutes. Then we will move into random groups organised by Emily Theobald, our IT expert, and that will be for about 20 minutes. Then we return back after that for a Q&A, which is going to be sorted, which you can put into the chat. And if I invite you to put them into the chat, could you label what you want answered as a question, put the word question up first, and then John will pick those up. So if people put comments in, they may not be picked up as questions. So anything with a question mark should have question written before it. Could I advise you too that this is all being recorded and the recording will be available afterwards. So, Professor Joe Camilleri is well known to most of the people here as one of Australia's leading international relations scholars. He's pursued a wide range of research interests covering almost the whole gamut of the international relations discipline. I hope Joe is not going to be offended tonight by my abbreviating the list of his quite lengthy achievements and published writings. In the interests of time, I simply want to say that in his spare time over the years, Joe has co-founded with his wife Rita Pax Christi in Australia, an international peace movement, and continues to have an active presence, particularly in Victoria. Which is why we're here tonight as we launch our important Pax Christi project for this year. Military security or human security, a vision for Australia. I invite Joe to explain what that's all about. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Katrina. I had not unmuted myself, which is rather silly, but now done. Well, may I first pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land I stand, and to all Indigenous leaders past and emerging, past, present and emerging, and look forward to the day when we extend to our First Nations the justice and recognition so long overdue. We have reached a transformative moment in human history. Yet, sadly, Australia still has to waken from its deep slumber. Oblivious, many Australians it seems, of the gathering clouds or of the new beginnings that beckon. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has signaled to the world more than once, catastrophic risks are pressing in on us. To quote him, "This is our moment to change course." By the way, this was said prior to the unspeakable Gazan genocide that is unfolding for all to see on our television screens. Let me begin then by sharing with you the thinking that lies behind Pax Christi's proposed human security project, which we hope will be fleshed out in consultation and collaboration with groups and networks of diverse backgrounds and interests. Australia's view of the world remains, as I think many of us know, deeply rooted in the history that begins with European settlement. A period of history that saw the First Nations of this country dispossessed, marginalized, and excluded from all decision-making. They were repeatedly made the victims of barbarous crimes, at times of genocidal proportions. They were effectively dehumanized. This was settler colonialism at its worst. And as the Voice to Parliament debacle has shown, we are still far from acknowledging, let alone healing, the wounds we have inflicted. The colonially inspired racism that has shaped our attitudes to Indigenous Australia has also coloured our relations with non-Western peoples in our region and beyond. We may have done away with the White Australia policy, yet racial prejudice and xenophobia remain alive in our asylum seeker and refugee policies, in relations, of course, with our First Nations, in our treatment of migrants of colour, and, as we shall see, in our military alignments and diplomacy. For White Australia, kith and kin still feel far away, and strangers and potential enemies uncomfortably close. Hence our deep-seated fears, our fixation with threats, and the visceral need for protection. Australia has rightly been labelled the anxious nation, or the frightened country. With the fixation on external threats comes the addiction to empire. Once the British Empire.
Did you get in, Moya?
No, I haven't. That link just took me to the...
More recently, the American Empire. We have been and remain trapped in the Anglosphere. This, by the way, is the deeper meaning of AUKUS. If we turn to our recent history, what do we see? A succession of perceived or imagined threats. Immediately after World War II and after Japan's surrender, we still saw the Japanese as a threat. And then a few years later, that was replaced by the communist threat. This was the age of Reds under the bed. And no sooner had the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall come down, in the post-Cold War period, came the Islamist threat. And in more recent years, the Chinese threat. Now, with this fixation on threats, Australia, a large island continent, one of the longest coastlines in the world, has felt very deeply the need for protection of great and powerful friends. And the question then becomes how to secure that protection. The answer, loyalty to the protector, unfailing loyalty. The need, therefore, to side with the protector in whatever conflict, by military force if necessary. Hence the need for Australia to have what's been called a forward defence policy. The willingness to fight at any time, there rather than here, and now rather than later. There is more to this, of course, than just a mindset, a national psychosis, if you like. And this is, I think, an important point to remember. It is a mindset that has been ruthlessly, relentlessly fueled and exploited by our military, intelligence, bureaucratic, political elites, and our media moguls. These elites see themselves as having privileged access to an exclusive and the world's most powerful club. Once the British club, now the American club. With difficulty, they resigned themselves eventually to the demise of the former, but still find it very difficult to accept the slow but steady decline of the latter, the American empire. In short, for the best part of 200 years, they have known, or they seem to think they know, that their bread is buttered by imperial power. Hence, our never-ending participation in, or at least support for wars of various kinds. The Boer War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Malayan emergency, confrontation with Indonesia, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, the War on Terror. And now the prospect, maybe in the future, of a war with China. And all of this has meant, in recent times, a ballooning security establishment. Perhaps if we could show the first slide. Here you see an extraordinary rise of Australia's defence spending in the aftermath of the Cold War, when we thought we would be at peace. From 7 billion at the turn of the century to now 52.6 billion and rising steadily, if not sharply. And then, next slide. That is not all the funding that goes officially into security. If you look at the ASIO budget, and ASIO is in the news, you can see how staffing has dramatically increased in the last 20 odd years, and you can see how the budget has increased even faster. And the Australian Federal Police, which does many things to do with security, including international security, other than policing at home, has also seen a very substantial rise of its budget. Next. And in the meantime, we see the dismal picture of poverty in Australia, while we spend these billions, including the proposed 368 billion.
Hello. Hi, if you can't get me, I suggest you try email. Cheers.
I think everyone should remain muted. If they need to say something, they should say it through the chat box. Over 3.3 million Australians live in poverty. I don't have time to go through it. You can see it all here, and the details will be sent to everyone. The next one. Here you see Australia's overseas aid. In 1970, the UN said advanced countries like Australia should aim for 0.7% of their gross national income devoted to overseas aid and development. 0.7. In the early 90s, we managed to get just over 0.3. And now we're steadily going downwards below 0.2. But we still have the necessary resources for $368 billion of nuclear-powered submarines. Next. US defense spending has followed the same curve. In fact, if you look at the Australian curve, very similar to the American curve, we follow the lead. And it now stands at above, all things included, well over $1 trillion, which is 1 million times $1 million US. Next. And the poverty in the US, if anything worse than in Australia, with Latino and Black Americans having rates of poverty below the poverty line of between 22 and 27 or 28%. Next. And just as a footnote, the expanding US military presence in Australia, which is gathering pace at an extraordinary rate over the last 10 years or so. So all of this is being done relentlessly, with little accountability, with severe costs to our diplomacy, to our security, and to our budgets. What's all this doing? It's depriving Australia of the capacity to contribute to the peaceful resolution of conflicts in our region and beyond. It demeans the values we supposedly cherish, human rights at home and abroad included. It reduces our support for the poor and marginalized at home and abroad, and it severely corrupts our democracy. And so, here is Pax Christi's message behind this project, and my firm belief. It is time to rise from this morass. We need as a nation to shift our gaze from the interests of our security establishment to the security needs of people in Australia and elsewhere. We need to listen to the cries of the poor and the marginalized, and importantly, the cries of the earth. In the words of the UN Secretary General, we must put people at the center of our actions. We must break down silos across sectors and institutions. We must boost inclusive partnerships that benefit from the perspectives of youth, women, and those whose voices are rarely heard, notably Indigenous peoples. And if Australia is to do this, we must be ready to revisit our past and reimagine our future. We need a new narrative that acknowledges the wounds of Indigenous dispossession and colonial violence. A narrative that calls into question the fears that have compelled Australia's addiction to imperial power. A narrative that makes way for constructive engagement with our neighbors in Asia and the Pacific. A narrative that deepens our appreciation of Australia's cultural diversity. I remind you, as we speak now, there are 5.5 million Australians that don't speak English in their homes. So we need to shift, in short, our focus from military to human security. New ways of thinking and acting that integrate security with economic and social needs, human rights, and environmental values. How do we make sense of human security? Perhaps thinking in particular of Australia's place in the world, we can do it by looking at three important aspects of human security: common security, cooperative security, comprehensive security. The three important C's or COs of human security. Common security, very simple. We need to reconcile the security interests of different parties. We need to be committed to the common security of all stakeholders. If we, Australia, expect our Asian and Pacific neighbors to respect our security interests, then we must be ready to respect their interests, their concerns. And in the case of the Pacific, we know that there are two primary interests, climate and the threat posed by nuclear weapons. And the same principle applies at home. We need to respect the security and sovereignty of our First Nations, for here lies the key to the security of country. And security needs to be cooperative. If we recognize the security needs of others, then we must act in concert with these others. And here Australia has a unique opportunity to pursue any number of joint initiatives, which it is not at the moment. with the likes of countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, New Zealand, and others, and regional bodies like ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum. To do what? To denuclearize the Asia-Pacific region, to get unanimous support for the nuclear ban treaty, including Australia's missing signature and ratification, to establish stronger nuclear weapons-free zones, zones of peace, release the easing of tensions around the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, the strengthening of peace-building and peacekeeping measures in tandem with UN initiatives, joint action on climate change, and much else. And cooperation is not just with governments. This is crucial. It has to be with the publics of those countries in whose name they act. Cooperation between civil society in Australia and civil society in those countries. And thirdly, human security has to be comprehensive. It has to protect from all that threatens the life and dignity of human beings, and for that matter, other forms of life. Yes, it is alert to the mortal dangers of war and all forms of physical violence, but it is equally concerned with human trafficking, with human rights, with refugee flows, with climate change, pandemics, economic arrangements that enrich the wealthy and exploit the poor, other creatures, and entire ecological systems. These concerns are closely interconnected. They are connected ethically, organizationally, and geographically. And so if Australia is to have a viable human security framework, it must engage the whole of government, the whole of society, federal government, state governments, local government, and this in close consultation with and accountable ultimately to the wider community. So you may well ask, where to from here? Australia, like other countries, needs to think long and hard about the immense risks, but also the remarkable opportunities before us. This will need, I should say, wholesale changes in policy direction and resource allocation. It will need a substantial overhaul of our institutions, our bureaucracies, and our military establishments. It will require a wide-ranging institutional shift. But here we pause. A change of this magnitude will not occur overnight, and certainly not by accident. It has to be one that engages civil society. It has to be accompanied and nourished by a cultural shift. And for this, we need a mature, respectful national conversation. Where will the leadership for such a conversation come from? Not from our mainstream media, not from our political class. It'll come from civil society. Who, you might ask, in civil society? We will need first, but not necessarily in order of importance, to turn our attention to those sections of the community, the many groups and organizations that are currently adversely affected by our current security policies. Who might they be? A few examples will suffice to illustrate. Of course, first and foremost, our own Indigenous communities and their organizations, but also the development and overseas aid sector, which has to mop up the mess created by wars and military conflicts, and whose support in terms of government aid for development and overseas reconstruction is faltering. We need to think of journalists, whistleblowers, advocates of various kinds, and lawyers concerned with human rights. Those working in such areas as poverty, homelessness, climate change, loss of biodiversity, public health, and threats to social cohesion. And we cannot forget educational networks, trade unions, cooperatives, think tanks, research centers, of course, cultural and religious organizations. So the key to a vibrant, human security-focused conversation lies in connecting these groups, these interests, these concerns, these areas of activity, in connecting the priorities and insights that they bring to their respective areas of interest. Human security discourse and practice will become effective when we make connections across these boundaries. The boundaries of areas of activity, the boundaries of age, gender, faith, nationality, culture, status, occupational background, and importantly, as I've said, different areas of social engagement. So we need a multidimensional national conversation using a wide range of resources, formats, and settings. We need a conversation to be conducted in different languages, and not just in the spoken and written word, but a conversation that also makes use of the visual and performing arts, sport, and much else. And yes, it is a daunting task, but there are positive signs. There are so many of us who feel frustrated by media hype, empty political noise, and uncaring institutions, and who are searching for alternatives. At the front of mind in all of this is, of course, the priceless contribution of our First Nations. It is their wisdom that can inspire and invigorate Australia's national conversation. And then we have a re-energized, early stages, but nevertheless, re-energized younger generation, concerned about the ravages of climate change, and a multitude of others beavering away on civil liberties, animal rights, issues of war and peace, poverty, social inequality, and importantly, the ethics of professional and public life. So we must now build bridges between these different efforts and perspectives, these different sorts of activities. In time, we may be able, and must strive for, community-wide consultations that can then pave the way for local and eventually statewide assemblies and culminate in some kind of national assembly, allowing for both face-to-face and online participation. And I remind everyone, human security is not an end point. It is not a destination. It's a pathway. It's a pathway for rethinking the profound insecurities of our age. It is a call to embark on a journey of renewal, ecological, economic, and political, no doubt, but also profoundly cultural and spiritual. And the purpose, straightforward, to give voice to the human spirit and begin to take care of life together.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that outlining for us who we need to get involved in this groundswell and have conversation with to change the conversation. I invite Naomi now to respond to what Joe has said. And if I could just take a moment to introduce Naomi. Naomi is a Trolway woman and a lecturer of Indigenous Studies at NIITS, which is formerly the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, an Indigenous learning community, and also Whitley College, part of the University of Divinity. Naomi holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Teaching and is presently finalising a Masters of Philosophy Research degree at ACU. I invite you, Naomi, now to give a response to Professor Camilleri's presentation.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see everyone, although if you're like me, the constant moving of Zoom is a bit distracting sometimes. So I'll try not to get too distracted. I'm a Trellaway woman who lives in Naarm on Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to thank the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to them as they continue to offer welcome and a home to my family. We are Yanabal visitors to Wurundjeri country. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations peoples gathered here. As a protocol of culture, I pay my respects to your elders and your ancestors past, present and future. And in the spirit of peace and the spirit of renewal, and in the spirit of what Joe was talking about, a new beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the non-Indigenous ancestry in the screen in your room, and pay my respects to your elders and ancestors past, present and future. I believe that our ancestral songlines have brought us together tonight to talk about this incredibly important initiative by Pax Christi, but something that is incredibly important for not only those of us who are human, but our non-human kin in the world, as we watch with horror through our social media and on the screens, and through direct involvement of relatives and colleagues, the terrible things that are happening, the military campaigns around the world, the genocides, some lesser known, some more airtime on mainstream television. As Katrina said, I work for NAITS, which is an Indigenous learning community, and I also work for Australian Catholic University. And my family is a little kooky. We have Aboriginal heritage from Trellaway, but we also have Jewish German history. And on my mum's side, my great-grandfather was part of the British and Commonwealth occupational forces that went into Japan after World War II to rebuild parts of Japan. And so my great-grandparents and many of my great aunts and uncles spent time on an army base in Kure, as my grandfather and others attempted to be part of that rebuilding. And many of my extended Jewish German family have suffered through the awful atrocities of World War II. And so this idea of war and peace has been part of my family story, and one that it's intrigued me. It's intrigued me because many of my relatives have done military service, my own brother, my cousins, my parents. I am what we call the family pacifist. Everybody else seems to enlist, I do not, because I honestly believe that there are different ways that we can build community, we can build the flourishing and the resilience of human and non-human kin. And part of the work that I have great privilege to do within the NAITS and Indigenous learning community, which is an international Indigenous community of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, is to try and find out ways how we can decolonise structures, and to do this for better tomorrows, so that we don't forget our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters or Indigenous peoples around the world, that we can find ways of tapping into that resilience within our ancestral stories into our community, and to see what brings us together rather than what brings us apart. Now, I'm not suggesting we do this in a Pollyanna way. I'm not a Pollyanna person. I find people who want to brush over things and not talk about the human cost and the cost to the rest of creation, and to just gloss over things and keep going, I find that deeply problematic. And I also find it not an approach that allows us to learn from how we get into conflict and how we can avoid conflict. We seem to be repeating history. And when we repeat history of this nature, of war and conflict and genocide, there are no winners. There are no human winners, and there are no winners in creation. If we look beyond the cost to humanity, We can see the cost of what happens when military exercises bomb, sacred sites and, repurpose waterways and all sorts of awful things that happen when people go into military conflicts. So I think Joe's points about the common, the cooperative, the comprehensive, these are really timely. And I'm reminded of the voice of my grandmother, who's long passed. She reminded me that violence can be brought about by one person, but so can peace. And I noticed just fleetingly a comment about the government, and apologies, I didn't really unpack it because I was concentrating on Joe. But I think one of the greatest things that prevents people from going into space where we can dream and actually put into action new ways of being is that we feel powerless. We feel paralyzed. We feel we're too old, we're too young, we're uneducated, we're too educated, we have no money, we have, and so on. And there's a myriad of excuses that we could remain paralyzed. Or we could say it's for the government to do, or it's for the churches to do, or it's for this person to do. I respectfully think that it's for you and me. It's for us to do. And I'm horrified at how much money is spent. I deeply appreciate you putting that on a screen, Joe, but I'm horrified at how much, like my brain is fried at how much money that is. Is this really how we are called to live? Is this really sustainable for us? Only Little Watson and the Aboriginal activists group in Queensland in about 1970, I wasn't born then, so it's around the 1970s, said, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And those words resonate for me because not only do they speak towards the reconciliation and the recognition and the timeliness of doing things better between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous Australians, but it speaks to what's happening around the world. Gaza, Yemen, Ukraine, just for a few examples. And I think that we have lots of strengths within our community. As I look across the screens, and there's 2 screens that I can see at the moment, I wonder, what gifts do you have? What skills and what yearnings do you have? You're here tonight through interest, through calling, through commitment already to Pax Christi. And I really believe that just with the 83 or so people, there is the great potential and capacity to work on these things that Joe has so skillfully and passionately outlined, the common, the cooperative, and the comprehensive. And I believe that one of the gifts that First Nations communities can bring is our resilience and our strengths and our reminder of our connectedness and our interconnectedness with the non-human world. So I think while we might be absolutely horrified with what is happening around the world, and so we should be, I think we do need to anchor ourselves to the hope and the capacity that we do have in this country. I'll confess, with the referendum, leading up to the referendum was quite difficult for many Indigenous peoples because people wanted to know how we were all voting and wanted to be convinced to vote yes or no, or and so it was a constant conversation. And I was quite concerned about what would happen after the referendum, whether it was a yes or a no. And after the referendum, when I was reviewing how people were voting, it was a very stark reminder that there is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that people understand what is at the heart of this conflict, what is at the heart of what we need to do as an Australian nation so that we can truly move forward as a united community that celebrates its differences and accepts the gifts of all. And I think by focusing on what we can achieve, and again, not glossing over the bad stuff, actually sitting down separately and together as communities and addressing some of the great needs, some of the trauma, just looking honestly at how did we get here? How is it that a first world country has so many people living in poverty? How is it that we as a first world country, we are spending so much on military, budgets, and we have a growing homelessness and a growing homelessness of people who have never been homeless before? Middle-class women, 55 and over, are one of the fastest growing demographics of homelessness in this country. How is that happening? So I think that we have a lot of work to do, but I think we have immense capacity. And I think Pax Christi is taking up the cause, which I have long wanted many church organisations, religious organisations, and one that many of our elders have always been championing. It's a great sadness to me that many people think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we are insular, that we don't care about any other community other than ourselves, and that is not true. Well, I can give you the one example of Uncle William Cooper, who walked towards the German embassy at great cost and protested against the actions of the Hitler government of the events of Crystal Night. We want to work with non-Indigenous communities, and there are many examples of that happening. So let's work together. Let's find a way where we can strengthen the common, the cooperative, and the comprehensive for the non-human kin that we so rely on, and we do, and for us as the human brothers and sisters of creation. Thank you for having me tonight, and I look forward to the small group questions and to the wonderful work that Pax Christi does. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Naomi, for your wise words there and the challenges you've thrown out to us within that. So now we're going to move into groups for about 20 minutes. And these are the main questions. What's your response to what you've heard? How do you see yourself collaborating with Pax Christi in this venture? Now, if you have questions in your group to put into the chat, wait until you come back into the bigger group to put those in. Otherwise, they become enclosed in the chat group, in the group that you're in. I'm sorry. So if someone could take responsibility within the group, that if there are any questions, to put those into the chat when you come back and label them as questions. Thank you. So over to you, Emily. Sorry about that. We were right in the middle of a good conversation there.
We were.
Probably the rest of you were too. You could probably finish those comments, some of those comments into the chat if you like, if you didn't feel as though they were heard. Now we move into this Q&A session. And I invite John now to lead us into that. John Ball, where are you?
Good, Katrina. Yes, I've only so far got maybe some ideas from the group I was actually participating in. So it may be that others from the other groups want to put up questions as it comes in. Now, others can also add if we have time. But I guess part of it was, I think Joe's partly addressed this, but how people often feel powerless on the scale of things, and what are the models for making people feel more empowered. So that would be one question, and some people are offering comments on that, but I won't go into comments people made. Another question would be, we need the idea of many, and one expression, given the majority of the population believes we need defense, is it being just too anti-American to advocate the more idealistic, if you like, approach that Joe was taking? That would be one thing that came through from some. I was wondering, a question for me is whether there's something in the New Zealand approach, the New Zealand model of foreign policy, from which we could learn or emanate. And another was the lack of coverage often in the media of the wisdom or otherwise of such large military budgets compared to what the money could be used for human need. Yes, and mutual interdependence and humility with the creation and with one another. So that was, yeah, I guess, how to get that debate in the media and get the community thinking in other terms. Maybe they're sufficient, I think, at this point.
There's a few questions there, I think. And there's also a question that our group put into the chat, John. So you might look at that as well.
Right.
Joe and Naomi, would you like to respond?
Does Naomi want to have a go? Or
I'll defer to you, Joe, I think.
okay. Well, I will address one, maybe two related questions. There were quite a few, but connected questions. One had to do with the question of powerlessness and empowerment. I think the short answer to that is there is no magic wand. If you at a given moment, if I or anyone else at a given moment feels powerless, there's no magic wand that one can wave, and a minute later you feel empowered. It requires, I think, a choice on the part of everyone. And the question boils down to, never mind about power. I'm empowered, I'm powerless, I'm powerful. Forget about power. And the question is, am I connected? Am I part of something? Could be a small project, a small activity, a small group, a large group, a big organization, a network. Am I? That has an interest in the kinds of issues and challenges and opportunities we've been discussing. And the short answer is, if you are, then that can lead to many good things. And if the answer is no, then I suggest you hurry up and become engaged with some group, some network, some activity, some project that takes your interest. But in doing so, I hope the group, and certainly you as member of the group or the network, will want to emphasize the need for connectedness. I was trying to make this point, perhaps I could have made it even more strongly. There is no point working tirelessly on homelessness and paying no attention to what's being done in our name in security. I'm sorry, I have to be very forceful. Just as it is, no point being in a peace group, worrying about arms and weapons manufacturing and arms sales and this and that, and taking no interest in homelessness. So we have to make the connections. Precisely because the kind of security we're talking about here this evening is about an interconnected notion of security. So whichever group or activity or project we end up being involved with, that's an important part of the message we should constantly be coming back to in the discussions, the opportunities for talking about things in groups. The final thing is, there is, I think, a tendency, and it's coming through some of the questions and comments, for people to feel disempowered because the mainstream media are acting in a certain way, or failing to act in a certain way, or a political class. And my simple message is, forget them. They are ultimately irrelevant. Irrelevant. Meaning, we can only do what we can do in our various areas of network and influence. And if we do, and a significant number of people do this, then that will have its impact on the media, the political class, as if some people call it, and so on. And that's exactly what happened with previous major movements, which were successful. The movements that brought an end to anti-apartheid, that were part of the anti-apartheid movement, brought an end to apartheid. A huge movement that lasted 25 to 30 years. The movement that brought an end to the Vietnam War. The movement that successfully brought an end to the Cold War. There are plenty of such examples, but it took thousands upon thousands of people acting in a variety of different ways and usually connecting the issues. So I think that, and the moment you become involved with a group and you're doing something, you're connected in some way, empowerment follows almost automatically. So there's no point painting the terrible picture here and there. We know about that. The question is what we can do with our respective capacities, times, energy, and resources. And we can all do plenty. That's enough from me.
Naomi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Joe. I think disconnection is one of our biggest enemies to sorting out new ways of looking at national identity, looking at national security. And I think we need to find new ways of defining what national security actually means. And how do we cost that? The costing not only the economic stuff, but the human and the non-human cost. And what are the pros and cons of that? At the moment, I can see that our current spending and our current focus is not sustainable. It's not one that is pro-creation, pro-life, pro-progress. And it forces us into binaries that are non-sustainable. And this is not me being anti-American or anything like that. In fact, my partner is Texan, and as I said before, I've got family, including my partner, in the military, and you know, but I really think we can do better and we can do differently in a way that maintains our national interests, but not at the sacrifice of long-term human and non-human prosperity, and in ways that allow us to have new ways of resolving conflict. The conflict in Taiwan, the conflict in Gaza, the conflict in our own area, you know, West Papua. You know, we had a particular way of dealing with East Timor, which was not in East Timor's interests. Australia was not ethical, and it cost East Timor. We don't want to make those mistakes anymore. There are new ways, or old ways even, if we listen to many Indigenous communities around Makarrata and other ways that we can resolve conflicts. But I think a lot of our national security is bound up with empire politics. And empires crumble, empires get taken over by other empires. And let's face it, if we look at all of the empires across the world, there are a great number of people within that empire that suffer greatly. Is that what we want going forward? I would hope not. And again, I'm not a Pollyanna person. I get frustrated with that stuff. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's debate all of this stuff. And I think we have a way forward to do that if we are brave. If you're waiting for someone to give you permission, for what it's worth, I give you permission. If you're waiting for someone to say that you've got the goods to do this, you got the goods. Journey with me and others to see what might be possible, to do the small actions and the big actions.
Thank you. There seem to be a few questions about practical next steps after what we've heard tonight.
Yes, that's certainly one, Katrina. That's a key, came out of a few. The other, I guess, is another theme coming out from a dialogue between Robert and I think Karen and so on, the to and fro, that of defensive alliances, and I guess that includes military alliance, in the idea that you've got to be strong in order to deter possible aggression. And the Taiwan Straits and Ukraine were particularly mentioned in that. So that was another general question. And the last question put was that we have the issue of at first, or the importance of confronting Australia's past, and that most particularly would be Indigenous, the treatment of Indigenous Australians, whether we need to address that first in being able to look at other issues. So they're the three things that I've picked up from the more questions that's just come in.
Thank you.
Do you want me to say something, Katrina?
No, I just want to say that, do you want to respond to those three different things?
And to the thing you mentioned, which is practical next steps.
Yes, I think
Yes.
it's coming
I'll
through from
start with that
people.
and only spend a minute or half a minute on some of the questions that John has raised, although they're all relevant and important. Yes, we've given quite a bit of thought to next steps. So I can tell you now that within 2 or 3 days, perhaps early next week sometime, everyone who registered, whether they were able to attend or not, and I understand more than 100 registered, will receive an email from us. I hope we will have the recording ready for those who would like to have it. We'll send it to everyone. But you will also receive a 4-page leaflet, glossy paper, etc., which carries a good part of the material I canvassed this evening, but goes into certain things more. It's an illustrated leaflet, it's quite attractive. And you will also get, in addition to that, you will get a little form, which might suggest 6, 7, 8 things that you may be interested in becoming engaged with and joining in some way. So we would ask you to please return that form within a week or so. We'll give you all the details. So that's immediate. In addition to that, for those who are really very interested in the issue, or you know of others, and that'll be, again, a question, an option stated in the form. In addition to the 4-page leaflet, there is a 16 or 17-page, I can't remember, discussion paper, canvassing all these questions in much more detail. For those who are foolhardy enough to read 16 pages, you're very welcome. We will make that available as well. And behind all those questions is not, would you be interested to have it? But how many people do you know who might be interested? And if so, we'll make as many copies available as you think you can make good use of. That's immediate. It'll happen by next week. In April and May, we propose to run 2 roundtables, one in each month, at which we'll invite clusters of groups and organizations or individuals with significant roles in those groups and organizations, covering many of the areas I highlighted, with a view to getting their reactions, their feedback, and ways in which they might be able to become engaged in what is going to be an ambitious and fairly long-term project, that they would become, that we would do this in consultation and collaboration with them. So that's already all planned for the next 2 to 3 months. And in the meantime, that'll be one of the questions in the form you receive. Do you wish to be kept informed as to developments as we go forward the rest of this year and perhaps well into next year and beyond? Now, I know there were questions about how do you deal with aggression? Well, the short answer is that if there is likely to be the use of force by someone, somewhere, sometime into an undefined future, and in order to prevent that from happening, you engage in the meantime in 25 wars and military conflicts around the world, I'm wondering whether that is the best way to cope with the problem. I have my doubts. For those of you who may not know this, in the 20th century, the United States engaged in 37 wars, one every 3 years. And in the 21st century, it engaged in 12 wars so far, one every 2 years. And it may well be on the road to a 13th. All in order to, we were told, the justification to prevent aggression. In the case of China, they have used force outside of their boundaries since 1949, the coming to power of the communist regime. And in that time, they have engaged in the use of force outside of their boundaries 3 times, and each time very small and very brief. Do you think they feel threatened? Indeed, they do. But they are very, very, very cautious in the use of force outside of their boundaries. And I think we would all do well to be equally cautious. Because the moment you build up force on a big scale, ostensibly to meet someone's aggression, this may often turn out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we've got to guard against that. That's why common security and comprehensive security is a much better path forward for dealing with potential outbreaks of force than is the arming to the teeth through huge defense budgets and military alliances.
Naomi, do you wish to add to that? Thank
No,
you.
I think Joe's eloquently dealt with that.
Joe, there's a question here that should we look at the outset of this campaign to allies with similar priorities?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it ties in with a question that John relayed a minute ago, which I didn't deal with, and that's New Zealand. It's very important. I want to push this because it's not always easily getting through, even within those who are very sympathetic to the cause of human well-being and the well-being of all life. They keep thinking about government. I don't think about government. I think about the people. Always think about the people. So when you think New Zealand, don't think government. And governments come and go. And there's one present in office, which is not very nice. if you're interested in justice and recognition of the Maori in people of New Zealand, they're in for a torrid time. And so on. So, but the New Zealand people, yes, they've done great things, and we have a lot to learn from them, and we should be working closely with them. And when it comes to Southeast Asia, yes, there are people doing great things in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and other places. We should be working with them. So my first point of connection is with civil society in other countries and with a multitude of groups that are beavering away, trying to promote the well-being of life on Earth, human beings and the planet as a whole. There are plenty of those groups. Let's connect with them. At a later stage, when these links are extensive and deepening, we may give some thought to what this government or that government may be doing as well, and establishing some useful links. But that wouldn't be my starting point. Don't worry about governments, but worry about the people, the communities, civil society. Governments are reactive beasts, the reactive creatures. They respond to where there is energy and muscle. They don't respond to intellectual argument, I'm sorry to say. And they often do not respond to moral argument, but they do respond to the energy of the people. They have to, otherwise they may not survive. And so it's that energy, that drive that we have to generate. And after that, it may prove influential with people we call government. And let me add, it's often not prime ministers and ministers, but it is the powerful currents behind them. The powerful currents that drive ostensibly governments that have been elected to do the things they do because they think that's the power, where the power lies. And it is they who can influence and manipulate opinion. And therefore they better do as they are told. And they do, by and large, as they are told, unless there is a very significant counterweight which makes them sit up and take notice.
Thanks, Joe. John, there's a question from the floor.
Yes.
Someone had his hand up.
Well, William had his hand up, Katrina, and then also Francis had a question. Should we be donating for all this, and if so, how? So that might be something you or Joe would address also.
John, I didn't catch that question. I didn't catch it.
Oh, should we be donating to all this? Francis has asked. If so, how?
Should we be donating?
Yes, yes.
What?
Funds, I suppose, maybe.
Oh.
That's, yeah.
I'm not clear what you're saying, John.
Oh, no, I think the question from Francis was, should we be donating for all this? And if so, how? I think a donation to Pax Christi would probably be one avenue of supporting the work. You may have others.
Good.
But also, William had his hand up. Francis, did you want to clarify it? You have
No,
to unmute.
I just wondered, I thought we need to have some money. If you're going to be sending, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, if
Yes.
you're going to be sending out brochures and leaflets and things, it can't be done without a bit of money. So, I mean, presumably, unless somebody's very rich and has, but mostly, I just wonder if there's a way, if it would be helpful if we donated some money. A little bit, whatever.
Thank you. Katrina, that'll be one of the boxes that some people may choose to tick in the form that go out.
Thank you.
Good.
Wayne, you've had your hand up for ages. Do you want to say something?
I just wanted to just say that having worked as a public servant and having had a lot of contact with politicians, I agree with Joe that we're far better to work with ordinary people and with non-profit organisations first before we move contacting politicians. I just wanted to say that a great peace person, Johan Galtung, died just recently, 94 years of age. Just like the fact that he did tremendous amount of work on looking at non-violent ways to solve international problems. So that's about all I want to say. Everything that Joe has said resonates with me very strongly.
Thank you. Thank you. John, were there other questions that you were, other people with hands up that you were seeing?
No, I think Joe's addressed most of the others, including the thing of deterrence, military deterrence or not, when you feel threatened. So unless someone wants to type another question in the chat, if we've still got time.
Perhaps, Katrina, John has mentioned the word deterrence, which of course has been a concern of Pax Christi and many, many other groups for many years. And of course, many governments rely on what they call the ultimate deterrent, which of course is the nuclear weapon, and that's why it's called nuclear deterrence. And it's based on a bargain that nobody who has the nuclear weapon will ever use it, which is a very bold expectation, because it's not just a question of nobody using it, but nobody ever using it in perpetuity, and nobody ever using it by accident or miscalculation. So that's both willful use and accidental use, or the result of miscalculation. And that is a terrible bet to make when what is at stake is the future both of humanity and the planet. And it bears repeating that this nuclear deterrent that some people have developed, some countries, and which Australia still relies on, namely the US nuclear umbrella, is a deterrent that has caused enormous harm to the indigenous people of this country through nuclear testing, and similarly with the peoples of the Pacific. And that has yet to be fully acknowledged and proper reparation made for the enormous damage that's been done to human health and environment. And that's all in the name of a deterrent that has yet not been used, but widely tested. So I think we need to think twice, 3 times, and 4 times, and remembering that Australia has yet to sign up to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, even though it said it would prior to the election. And there's one clear reason why it hasn't. The so-called government is getting advice from certain powerful quarters not to go ahead with it, at least not now.
I'd also add, Joe, that it's not deterred wars from happening at all. They've gone on all the time. So it's not a deterrent.
I agree.
There are some more questions there, but I wonder if we might bring this to a close and ask Joe and Naomi to make some concluding remarks after the little bit of discussion that we've heard here. Would that be appropriate?
Perhaps Naomi would like to go first.
Yeah, thank you. I actually just want to finish with a quote from Eli Wiesel. I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take side. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. And I would say when we hear about humanity, let's increase that to the non-human kin. And I truly believe that with the capacities of intellect, cultural, religious resilience, traditions, dreaming, that we can do things better. We can do things differently. And I really believe that our survival depends on us doing so. And thank you for having me tonight. And I've been watching the questions, and you've given me much food for thought. So I believe I've learned more than I've imparted to you. So blessings from my family and my tradition to yours.
Thank you, Naomi. And Joe, have you got some wise words to finish with?
Well, very brief words, because Naomi has said it so beautifully and I've spoken a lot. Just to say, to remind people, this is but a very small beginning of something that we hope will become quite large. And at the end of the day, Pax Christi may become irrelevant to the journey ahead. In other words, play a relatively small part. We're simply initiating by way of an invitation to everyone who may be so moved, be they individuals or groups or members of groups, to bring their insights, their perspectives, their energies, their contacts to the task that we have set out, which is to change the narrative, to change the conversation, and to widen the circle of Australians who feel it worthwhile to take part in that conversation. So I thank everyone. Thank you, Katrina, and thank you to all who participated. And hopefully it will make a difference over time if we choose to do so.
Thank you, Joe. You've stolen my thunder now. Thank you to you, and thank you to Naomi. Thank you to everyone who's stood the distance, and you're still here. Thank you for enrolling anyway and being part of this journey with us. Thank you to the facilitators, some of whom stepped up at the last minute. And a special thanks to Emily for doing our IT work too. So we can give all of ourselves a big clap. And we'll see you again, we hope. Good night and God bless.
Thank you, everyone.